Ladies and gentlemen, at an early meeting where this day was sketched out, I was unwise enough to make the comment that with such intensive work on the core of the site, which you heard about in the course of today, and with such interesting work going on also in the estates, it would be interesting for somebody to look at the space in between the outer part of the precinct and its immediate setting. Hence I signed myself up to say something about this afternoon. And in fact there are interesting things to say here, as I hope you see in the next few moments. I should also say before I launch into this that I shall be describing work, much of which has been done by other people, by Stuart Brown for example, where we have been going back to look at the standing remains and have been able, I hope you see, to extract a great deal of fresh information about them. Well, the first step in all this, which we undertook in 2007 and 2008, was to try and pin down our information regarding the Abbey more thoroughly by having a fresh topographical survey conducted by Downland. If you wish to consult this, you can actually download it. It's online on the Archaeology Data Service website, and this has provided a fundamental point for us in recording the new Abbey. Let me turn my attention to the northwest corner of that survey, and you'll see the great church and the Avetts Kitchen, which you'll hear a bit more about at the moment, with St Patrick's Chapel. And incidentally, for those of you who are asking this morning, Silver Street is the curving boundary just at the top right of that plan. Let me turn my attention to the North Precinct Wall. When you view the Abbey nowadays, you see that the precinct wall generally is about 3 meters high, perhaps a notional 10 feet or so. But at one point, there is a prodigious wall separating the precinct from the town. Here you'll see a section of it, and you will notice that it is a mighty thing, 5 meters tall, and almost certainly about 1 meter buried below ground as well. So a very tall wall, about 6 meters high initially, and you'll see even from a distance that at intervals there are regularly placed holes in it, some of which are putlock holes, but some of which are not. If you carry your eye, in fact, down to the left of the last illustration, you will see that this mighty wall carries on for a length of fully 90 meters. If we look at just a section of it, as I am showing here, you'll see about half a meter above ground level, arrowed in a couple of places here, large blocks of dressed dolting stone. You'll see a series of holes about 1.5 meters above those, and you'll also see at the top of the view that there are spaced at the same regular intervals but syncopated in relation to the dolting stones at the bottom of the view, further dolting blocks. Now, I should add that, as you'll see, the quality of the stone chosen for this work is actually very poor and is typical of Tor Burrs stone. You heard a little about Tor Burrs this morning, and typically it's used in the earlier buildings of the Abbey, late Saxon buildings and Norman buildings. It does continue in use into the 13th century. For example, the Magdalen almshouses on the outer edge of the precinct employ this material, but generally in the later Middle Ages it was eschewed, and grey lias became the much more common material, or dolting ashlar for the principal buildings. You also heard this morning that a feature of the Romanesque buildings has often proved to be the presence of a yellowish mortar, distinguishable from the very typical white lime mortar of the High Middle Ages. And the same characteristic of yellow mortar is evident in this structure. I'm not the first person to notice that this must surely be one side of an enormous building. Warwick Rodwell appreciated this about 15 years ago and undertook a first phase of recording there. And it's difficult to know quite who discovered what in these situations, isn't it? But possibly it's Humphrey Woods, who excavated in this area at much the same period, the late 80s and early 90s. He too was aware of the presence here of what each of the three of us concludes is a very substantial building. Here you're looking at 2.5 bays of that structure with regularly spaced dolting below as described. You'll see that above each of the dolting blocks there are holes, timber holes, which are not putlog holes, and in between those, spaced at regular intervals, there are further but smaller cavities. These, it seems to me, must be a building, and the top stones, therefore, the ones arrowed in blue above, must be, I think, its roof. What's remarkable about this is how extensive it is, because although you're looking at 2.5 bays here, that stretch which you saw in my initial view of the North Precinct Wall amounts to 13 bays. There's then a breach in the wall, and there are 13 further bays extending to the west. This is a mighty structure, and although it completely lacks architectural features, it does deserve to be better known as what must surely be one of the largest precinct buildings standing in any monastic site in Britain, which is likely to date to the 12th or 13th century. You've heard my reasons for thinking this is likely to be the case. They hinge on mortar colours and the choice of materials rather than architectural features. And we might wonder whether that whole length of fully 90 metres of wall, most of which still stands at least 5 metres high, we may wonder what sort of context that has and what sort of function the building has. I put this in just as a sketch to show you what sort of scale of building we're dealing with. You can see that it's fully as long as the nave and the transepts together. That is a mighty structure, and that description of Adam of Durham's description of Henry of Blois buildings as princely buildings is obviously one possible context for such a grand affair. We may assume that since it faces south, that it was lit on its southern side, although blind on its north, which forms the precinct wall to the town. Whatever its date, it is clearly an extremely grand addition to our knowledge of the monastic buildings of the site. As for its function, you may note that adjacent to it, nowadays closed off, is the most likely site for the entrance from the town into the Abbey precinct, and this may indeed have been the principal entrance to it before the 14th century. I must skip boldly on to say we're looking along the length of the North Precinct Wall and looking south-westward, where you will see in the middle ground a retaining wall and St Patrick's Chapel. This too has been subject to our interest in recent years. There's what it appears like from the east, where Stuart Brown has been conducting a detailed stone-by-stone survey. And as with the great church, here was an instance of a building which appeared completely straightforward at superficial examination in most regards, but as tends to happen, on close examination, this simple one-phase building, always described as the chapel erected in 1512 by Abbot Beer to serve the newly built almshouses, proved to be a much more complex structure. And in fact, Stuart identified 6 medieval phases of work, of which only the very last is certainly a chapel. And in fact, the story of that structure begins not with a building, but instead with a series of enclosures, which I shall return to. Our other focus of interest at the moment in the area outside the great church and Lady Chapel is the Avetts Kitchen. this wonderful building, quite wonderful building, has never, it seems to us, ever been seriously studied since Pugin made a handsome record of it, which he published in 1834. We're looking at the inside, and here we've sought the advice of Peter Briers, the food historian, who points out something which we believe is a new discovery, which is that although when you first look at it, each of the four corners of the building looks plain, when you look at them carefully, they're all different from one another, and there are sockets and other features which show fairly clearly that each of the four corners serve a different function. One, Peter suggests, as a pastry oven, one for roasting, one for baking, and so on. We are just starting a project to look at that closely. We are in the process of providing a fresh 3D record, which will be extremely valuable in this sort of situation. A new model should tell us quite how accurately Pugin recorded the thicknesses of the vault, for example, and the thicknesses of the lantern. Peter and us, as we've worked together, have noted also there are other internal features, including that arrangement on one side you see there, which he suggests is for the use of the pastry cook. We are looking at it in the context of Avetts Hall with Gerald, as you heard this morning, and the point I might draw your attention to here is that not only is it obvious that it's the one surviving component of a suite of at least 3 rooms, but the front wall of it is quite different, and as you see arrowed here, from the remainder, and incorporates a very high enclosure wall, which is separate from the structure of the remainder of the building. This leads me on to another interesting point which these two exercises remind us of, which is that at the northwest corner here of the cloister, of the precinct, there actually is some very interesting evidence for the internal divisions of the precinct and the use of space there. And here we have the evidence of the senior mat, for example, going back to the early 17th century, the evidence of Holler. I would skip through these, and Stukely, and as ever valuable, Carter's sketches in 1820, features which were eventually demolished in 1820, dating at the end of the 18th century, which all provide evidence of a series of boundary walls which have been demolished in large part nowadays. To those we have Humphrey Wood's evidence from excavation in the 80s. You heard about Hollin-Rake's very useful survey of parch marks in the late 80s and of electricity cables, and more recently the work which has been made possible through the Reading University project of geophysical survey. Putting these things very briefly together, the picture which emerges on the northwest corner of the precinct is that there were a series of quite large enclosures of quite different functions. There was a separate area which gave access to the hall. The Avetts Hall was distinct from the remainder of the claustral buildings and served by a separate gatehouse with its own long passageway. There was a separate series of enclosures on the north side, including the almshouses, and an adjacent enclosure which was probably used for the sacrist. So in amongst all this evidence which has emerged, and there's also this very nice evidence about the setting of the main monastic building. So I recommend that to you, and this is a project which will proceed over the next 2 or 3 years. Thank you.